In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural gardening soil material in Blender. And this material will also work really great for a mud material or a dirt material if you want some sort of earthy material. And then after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node group with these different custom sliders. And I've added a subdivision surface onto this object so that the displacements have lots of detail, but it is a little bit laggy in the viewport, so I'm just going to turn off the subdivision surface in the viewport just so that it's a bit less laggy. So we have the overall scale to change the entire scale of the material. Then we also have these different clump colors, so I can just change this. You can see it's going to change those clumps of dirt. Then we also have 3 dirt colors, so if you want to change the color of the dirt, you have lots of different options to change the color of the dirt. And then we also have the clumps amount, so if I turn it up to 2, you can see the soil is more clumpy, or if I turn it down, it looks a bit more noisy. Then we also have the roughness, so if you want some more dry dirt or very wet dirt, you can change that. And then we also have the bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength. If you'd like to help support this channel and purchase this material, then you can do that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. You can also check out my procedural material packs and my ultimate material pack to purchase more of my materials. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So let me just show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere. And then right behind me, if you click on the little Add Icosphere Settings, just open this up. I want to turn the subdivisions up to 6 because I do want a nice smooth sphere to preview the material on. And we're also going to be using the displacements in the node editor. And so I do want a very detailed mesh for the displacements to have more details. And then I will also shade the object smooth. Now when modeling to the real life scale in Blender, the default primitive objects are a little bit higher than an average human. So what I want to do is go to front view by pressing the 1 on the numpad, and then I want to scale this down and I want to make it much smaller. And I'm going to make it roughly about 4 of these grids here. So you can see the grids in the background. I'm going to make it the size of about 4 of those grids, and then I will press Ctrl A. I'm just going to apply the scale. So this is now the object's new default size. So now maybe it's about the size of a large rock when modeling to the real life scale in Blender. And then I also added a camera here, and I just pointed the camera at the sphere. And also if you select the camera and then go right over here to the camera properties, I turn the focal length up to 80 just because that kind of zooms the camera in and I think it looks a bit nicer. Now for the lighting, I added a few different area lights here. So this first area light right here, I pointed it kind of down at the sphere and I set the power to 80. And then this other one here, this one is a little bit behind the sphere to kind of give it a rim light here on the back side. And this one I set the power to 75. And also to get some even more realistic lighting and reflections, right over here on the world properties, I added in the Machine Shop 02 HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Links in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can add a new world. And then right here next to color, you can click on the yellow dot and you can choose environment texture. And then you can click on the open button and open up the downloaded HDRI. And then I didn't want it to be quite that strong because it was a little bit too bright. So I just turned the strength down to 0.6. Now also if you go right here to the render properties, if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see the HDRI in the background, you can open up the film tab right here and then you can check mark the transparent button, and that way the world won't be quite as distracting in the background, it'll be transparent. And then to make the lighting and the colors look a bit nicer, here in the color management, I'm using the view transform of Filmic and the look to very high contrast. Now I am going to be using the displacements in the node editor to actually pop out the mesh. So if you want to use the node editor displacements, then you will need to be using the Cycles rendering engine because material displacements are not supported in Eevee. So just make sure you're using Cycles. So I'm going to select this object and then I'm in the shading workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right over here and I'm in the rendered mode. And then I also have the shader editor right over here. So I'm just going to click on new to add a new material. And let's just rename this material to gardening soil, or you can also just rename it to dirt or mud or whatever you want to call it. Now to make sure the displacements actually work, once you add this material, you need to click right over here on the material properties and you need to go down here to settings and then open up surface. And right here on displacement, we want to change this to displacement and bump. And this is telling this material that it can use the displacements. And then I also want to add even more geometry to this mesh. If I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see this mesh is pretty high detailed already, but I do want to make it even more detailed so the displacements have lots of geometry to use. So I'm going to go back into object mode, and then if you click right over here on the modifier properties on this object, I'm going to click on add modifier, and I'm going to add the subdivision surface modifier. And then if it's too laggy for your computer, then you could definitely turn the viewport levels down, and that way there won't be quite as much detail in the viewport, but I want to turn the viewport and render levels all the way up to 3, so that way there will be 3 levels of subdivision, so the displacements will have even more geometry to use. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes, so if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit, and then you can go to the preferences, and then over there in the add-ons tab, just search for a Node Wrangler and checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. So we're actually going to be creating 2 different shaders, and then we're going to be joining them together. So the first shader that we're going to make is a basic dirt shader, and then we're going to duplicate that shader and make another shader in the same material, which are kind of some dirt clumps. And then we'll be joining them together and adding the displacements. So to start off, I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop the Voronoi here, and then because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, I can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object. And then with the Voronoi texture selected, I'm also going to press Ctrl T, and that will add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So let's put the object into the vector. And then this mapping node here can just be used to change the entire size of the material, and we will be using this later when we set up the custom node group. Now I want the Voronoi texture to be smaller because you can see it's really big right now, so there's just some big dots here and there. So I want to turn the scale up to like a 35, and that way we have a bunch of little dots. Now I want to make this look more noisy and random to make it look more organic and natural. So I'm going to add a texture in between the vector, and this way it'll distort the placement of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture, and let's put that between the mapping and the Voronoi. So because the noise texture is going through the vector, it's distorting the placement of the Voronoi texture. And then let's also change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up quite a bit to like 50, and then I also want to make it very detailed, so let's turn the detail up to 15, and now you can see there's much more detail. You can see it looks very noisy in there. And then I also want to turn the roughness up just to give it a bit more detail, so I'm going to turn the roughness to a 0.65. I think 0.65 is pretty good, so if you zoom way in, you can see it's very detailed. Now that is actually being distorted way too much, and so I want to basically have the Voronoi texture have less of an effect on the Voronoi. So to do this, I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node, and let's drop the mix node right up here. And then I don't want to use float because that's going to be number values, so let's click on this, and I'm going to change it to color instead. And then I want to put this mix node in between the noise texture and the Voronoi. Now I want to drag the noise texture down, and I want to take this original mapping here. This is not distorting the texture at all, and I want to take the vector and I want to put that into color A. Then this noise texture here, I actually want to take the factor and I want to put the factor into color B. And now you can see it's giving us this really cool texture. And so now we have this factor, and the factor is telling it how much it's going to use of A and how much it's going to use of B. So if I turn the factor all the way up to 1, it's distorting it very much. But if I turn the factor way down, it's not really distorting it hardly at all. Now you can see when I drag this around, it's moving the texture around a lot. So I'm going to click on this mix here, and I'm going to change the type to linear light. This way I can drag the factor around and it will still distort the Voronoi, but it won't be moving it around quite as much. Now I want to make the factor very subtle, so I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.04, and that way it's just distorting it a little bit, so you can still see the dots of the Voronoi, but there's a bit of noise here and there over the Voronoi. And that is the base of our dirt texture. Now this texture coordinate and mapping, I'm going to be using these nodes later, so I actually want to drag them up here so that then we can plug them into the other material that we're going to create up here. And then also what I want to do is hold down the Shift key, and then I want to right click and drag over these 2 wires and then let go, and that is going to add a reroute, and I can just drag this down, and this is totally optional, you don't need to do it, but it'll just make the nodes look a bit nicer. So now I want to change the colors of the Voronoi texture. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for another mix node. Let's drop this here, and then we want to change the type to color again because we're working with color values. And let's drop it here after the Voronoi, and we actually want to put the Voronoi distance into the factor value. So then here on A and B, we can make the colors of the dirt. So for color A, I'm going to make this a orangey color and make it darker so that it is kind of a dark brown, make it a bit darker. And then here on color B, I want this to be a similar color, so kind of like a brown color, not very saturated, but this one is going to be a bit of a lighter brown. And if you want to use the exact same colors that I'm using, then here on color A, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 2F, 251D. That's the exact color that I'm using. And then here on color B, if you click on the color and go to the hex, I'm using a hex value of 6F6052. Now I actually want to make this Voronoi texture a bit more contrasty, so I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp in between the Voronoi and the mix, and I can drag the principled shader over. So now I can drag around these values of the color ramp, and that's going to make either the lighter values brighter or the darker values darker. So I'm just going to drag the black tab out here a little bit, and then I'll also drag the white tab over a bit. And that way it's just a little bit more contrasty. Now I also want to add a bit more noise into this entire material, just because I think some of these areas here could use a bit more noise and a bit more randomness. So I'm going to click on this mix node and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after the first one. So I want to take the result here and I want to put that into value A, and then to mix in a bit of noise, I want to take this noise texture, I'm going to take the factor, and I'm going to put that into the factor of the mix here. And then here on color B, I can click on this and I'm going to make it a bit of a darker brown color. Now you can see it's kind of making the entire material darker, and so I want to make this noise texture more contrasty because the noise texture factor is going into the factor of the mix, and so that's telling it where it's going to be A and where it's going to be B. So I'm actually going to click on this color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it up here. And I actually want to drag it so that it is going here on this wire, and I want to let go. And this way, if I now drag this back, this noise texture factor is going into the color ramp, and then the color ramp is going into the factor of this mix node. So I can now drag the black tab and the white tab closer to each other, and that'll make that noise texture more contrasty. If you want to see what it's doing, you can Control Shift and select the color ramp, and then you can kind of drag this around and you can just see what that's doing. So I can now Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it, and you can see it now looks quite a bit more noisy. And then also, if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using for color B, here on the color, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in 2F, 281F. That's the exact color that I'm using. So now you can see we have a really nice texture for the dirt. So let's take the result here from the mix, and I can put that into the base color of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now this dirt material is way too shiny, so I want to take the color ramp here and I want to put the color ramp into the roughness. So let's take the color, I can put that into the roughness, and that way some parts will be a bit more rough and other parts will be a bit more shiny. Now that is like way too shiny. You can see some of these areas look very wet, so I want to have more control over the roughness. So let's actually click on this color ramp, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here before it goes into the roughness. And I can also box select these and kind of bring them over so I have a bit more space. So now I want to drag these back over here, and then if I make the values lighter, they're going to be more rough. So if I click on this black tab here and click on the color, I can turn this up and you can see the dirt is going to be more rough. So I just want to make it kind of a gray color. And the hex value for this gray color is going to be 5E, 5E, 5E. Now this dirt is also very smooth, and so I want to add some data into the normal to give it some bump. So I actually want to take the Voronoi texture distance and let's put that into the normal of the principled shader. And then to convert it to proper normal data, I need to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and let's put the bump node here in the wire before it goes into the normal. And then I actually want the Voronoi texture distance to be going into the height value. And now you can see it's converting it to normal data, and so we now have a really nice dirt texture. Now that is a bit too bumpy, so on the strength here, I'm just going to turn that down to like a 0.5 so it's a bit less bumpy. So that is the first dirt shader. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes, but I don't want to box select the material output, and I also don't want to box select the texture coordinate and mapping, but all these nodes in here. So I can now press Control J. Control J is going to join them together into a frame, and again this is optional, but I like to do this to keep the nodes nicely organized. And with the frame selected, you can press F2 and that'll add a label, and I can just rename this to dirt. So here's the first material. So I'm now going to duplicate this material and make another one up here, which is going to be the dirt clumps. So I'm going to click and drag to box select the frame and all the nodes in the frame. I can now press Ctrl-Shift-D. So Ctrl-Shift-D is going to duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wires plugged up so the mapping is still going into this shader. And then if I click on this frame right here, I can press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to clumps. And then also right over here on the mapping, if you want to, you can box select these two nodes here. You can press Ctrl-J, click on the frame here. You can press F2, and I'm going to just call this mapping. So let's now Ctrl-Shift and select this principled shader so that we can preview it, and we can now edit the clumps of dirt. So for this material, I want to click on this second mix here, and I want to press X to delete it. Let's also click on this color ramp here and press X to delete it because I don't need those. And then also this result here, I can put this into the base color. Now, because these are going to be little clumps of dirt, I actually want to flip the bump map because I don't want the clumps to look like they're going back in. I want them to instead be popping out. So let's click on the invert button, and now they'll look like they're popping out. And it is a little bit hard to see, but you can see it popping out kind of right there. But once we change this node setup, it'll look like it's popping out a bit more. So now let's change some of the settings here on these textures. So first I want to change the noise texture. So on the scale here, I'm going to turn this way up to like 150 so there is much more detail. And then this roughness here, I'm going to turn it down a bit. So I'll turn it to like a 0.55. And then also on the Voronoi texture here, I want to make the dots smaller. So let's turn the scale up to like a 45 instead. Now the noise texture is distorting the Voronoi texture way too much, and I want to be able to see these little clumps. And so the Voronoi texture, the little dots of the Voronoi texture will create those little clumps. It's being way too distorted right now though. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, you can see now we have those little clumps. But that is of course not being distorted at all because we turn the factor to 0, so it doesn't look very organic or natural. So I'm going to turn the factor to a very small number of 0.005. So now you can still see there are little clumps there, but it is being distorted, and so now it looks like little clumps of dirt. And then I also think it looks a bit better if we use the color value instead. So here on the noise texture, I'm going to use the color. So I'll put the color into value B instead of the factor. Now I also want to change the contrast of the texture. So I'm going to bring the mix right up here before it goes into the base color, and I can also bring the color ramp up here. So I now want to drag this back so that the black tab is over here, but then I want to drag the white tab out a bit. And if I drag the white tab out a bit, now you can see that those little clumps of dirt are a bit smaller. If I Control Shift and select the color ramp, we can see what it's doing. So if I drag this around, if I drag the white tab over, it's going to make those dots smaller. And then I also want to click on the color, and I want to make this just a little bit darker so it's not quite as bright. And the hex value that I'll be using for this white color is going to be D9, D9, D9. And then let's Control Shift and select the principled shader again so that we can preview this material. Now I also want this color ramp to be just using the Voronoi texture instead because I don't want it to be using this color ramp here. So let's just take the distance of the Voronoi and I'm going to put that into this color ramp here, and that's the color ramp that goes into the roughness value. And then I also want to make the clumps of dirt a lighter dirt color. So let's go to this mix here, and on color A, I'm going to make this kind of a lighter brown, and then here on color B, I'm going to make this a darker brown. And I'll also make it a bit more saturated. And to use the same exact colors that I'm using, here on A, you can punch in a hex value of 62, 4F, 3F, and then here on color B, you can punch in a hex value of 3C, 3028. So I can now Control Shift and select between the two shaders, and you can see we have some clumps of dirt and then just a base dirt shader. So I now want to join them together to make a really cool dirt shader. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix shader. So let's drop the mix shader down here, and then I want the top shader here to be going into the top shader, and then this bottom one here, this is going to go into the bottom shader. So now this mix shader is mixing between the two dirt shaders, and then the factor value is going to blend between only using one or only using the other, or if it's in the middle, it's kind of going to blend between both of them. I want to have the tips of the clumps to be popping out, but then I want most of the material to just be the dirt shader. So what we can do is we can actually use this texture right here from the clumps, and we can put that into the factor. So what I first want to do is press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node, and let's drop the mix node here in between these two shaders. And then I want to click on the float, and I want to change it to color instead. So I'm going to use this mix, and I'm going to mix this Voronoi with this noise texture, and that way we'll have the Voronoi texture, which is the texture of the little clumps, but then we're also going to add in a bit of noise just to make it a bit more noisy. So let's take the distance from the Voronoi, and I'm going to put that into the factor, and then let's also take this noise texture factor, and I'm going to put that into color A. And then let's Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now if you click here on the type, I want to change it to darken instead. So now you can see that's a bit darker, it's adding the dark values, and I also want to turn this to fully black. So now we have a pretty nice texture here. Now I pretty much just want to be able to see the tops of the clumps, so I want to make this more contrasty. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the darken. Then I can drag these two tabs together, and that's going to make it more contrasty, and I actually want to flip the values, so let's actually drag the white tab over here, and then the black tab over to here. So now that I've flipped these, you can see the tops of the clumps are very noisy because we've mixed it together with this noise texture, but the tops of the clumps are black and then the rest of the material is white. So now that we've created this very contrasty texture, we can put the color here into the factor. So I can now Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. So you can see now where those black areas are, that is where the clumps are going to be, but then where the values are white, that is where the dirt is going to be. Now the clumps really do stand out quite a bit, and we are going to be adding displacements, and when we add the displacements, it'll be much harder to see the clumps. But if for some reason you don't like how visible the clumps are, or if you don't want to use the displacement, you can play around with this color ramp. So I could drag this back a bit or drag this over here, and if I drag this over there, now you can see the clumps are much less visible. And also right up here on the clumps texture, you could also play around with this factor. So if I turn this up, it's going to be distorting it more and more, and so now those clumps are very distorted and they look a bit more noisy. But I'm going to leave this how it is, but that's what's so great about using procedural materials, is you can edit the material to make it look exactly how you want. So I'm now going to finish up the material by adding the displacements. Now before I add the displacements, I did find that the subdivision surface modifier is a bit laggy in the viewport because this is a pretty high detailed mesh. So right here on the levels viewport, I'm just going to turn this down to 1, and this is the subdivision surface modifier on the material properties. But then it will still render with 3, so it'll be higher detail. So I'm just going to make this panel smaller so we have more space. So if I Control Shift and select this color ramp here in this dirt material, this is a really great texture for the displacements. So I'm going to take the color and let's put that into the displacement of the material output. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. Now you can see it's kind of jetting off to the side, and that's because we need to convert this color data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the displacement node, and let's put the displacement here before the wire goes into the displacement of the material output. And then we actually want the color ramp color to be going into the height value of the displacement, and that'll convert it to displacement data. Now it is bumping out way too much, it's kind of spiky, and that's because it's way too strong. So I want to turn the scale way down, and for me I've found that a strength value of 0.008 looks pretty good. So now you can see we have some bumpy dirt. And right now it actually isn't at its full quality. Here on the subsurf modifier, if I turn this up a little bit, now you can see it's much higher quality, but it is going to slow down the viewport a bit. So I'll just leave the levels viewport to 1, but then I'll keep the render at 3. And there we have it. So there is the procedural material. So I'm now going to show you how to join this together into a custom node group. So let's click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. And then I can press Control G. Control G will join it together into a node group, and I can press the Tab key with the node group selected to go in and out of the node group. I'm going to drag the node group over here, and then I'm going to click here on the name. I'll press Control C to copy this, click on the node group, and press Control V to paste the name. I can also drag it out to make it a bit bigger, and then I can Tab to go into the node group. Now if I press the N key, that's going to open up the side panel, and if you go to group, we have the different inputs and outputs. And if you click here on shader, I want to click on the shader and then click on the up arrow just to bring it up so that it's on the top, because I like that better. So now right here on the group input, we can add all the different custom values. So I first want to bring the group input down here, and then I want to take the scale and let's put that into the group input, because this mapping node is connected up to all the textures. And so if we change the mapping scale, that's going to change the size of the entire material. And then right here, if you click on scale, I want this to be a single number value. So here on the scale, if you click on the type, I want to change it to float instead. And then I want to change the default value to 1. And then I also need to press the tab key to go out of the node group. And on the scale here, I just need to turn this to 1. And then I can tab to go back into the node group. Now I could take the group input and I could drag it around, and then I could plug all the different values into it. But something that I'm going to try in this video, and something which I haven't tried yet before in my tutorials, is I'm actually going to duplicate this group input node, and then we can drag it around to wherever we need it, and we can plug up all the different custom values. And definitely let me know in the comments if you like this workflow better. I've tried this method a little bit off camera, and it is kind of nice. It is a nice way to organize all the nodes, so I might like it better, but let me know in the comments what you think. So the next value that I want to add is the clump colors. So what I can do is take the group input here, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it up here. So visually we have two of them, but these are actually the same nodes, because when we do something to this node, it's going to do the same thing on the other node. So just keep that in mind. And you can see this scale value, there isn't anything plugged up to it, but there is something plugged up to this scale value, so we can just ignore this other scale value. So because we have two of them now, I can now just drag this over, and I want to just stick this right in here, stick it next to this mix in the clumps. Then I can take value A and I can put that into the extra socket, and then value B, I can put that into the extra socket. And then if I click here on the group input, if I want to hide the other values that I'm not using, I can press Control H. So Control H will hide those extra values that we're not using, so it'll basically collapse the node and make it smaller. So now if I click here on A, I want to call this clumps color 1. And then here on B, I want to rename this to clumps color 2. So now if I go right back over here, you can see this group input also has the clumps color 1 and 2 because it's basically the same node. I'm just duplicating the node so that it's at a separate location, but these really are the same node because they're keeping the same data. But if I click on this group input here, I can drag this into the mapping, and then I'll just press Control H, and again, that'll hide the values that we're not using. So let's now do the same thing, but we're going to add another one right down here for these color values. So I'm going to click on this group input here. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it up here. And then to bring it out of the frame, I can just press Alt P. That will bring it out of the frame. I can now just drag this down here. Now, because this node has been collapsed, we don't have the extra socket that we can add values into. So I'm just going to press Control H just to open this up, and then I can add in the different colors. First, put in color B, then I want to put in the second color B, and then lastly, I want to put in color A. And then select the group input, and you can press Control H. That'll collapse the node group, so it just looks really nice. And then here on B, I can just rename this to Dirt Color 1, and I'm also going to rename this one to Dirt Color 2, and then this one here I'll rename to Dirt Color 3. Now, something that I don't like about this workflow is that if I go right up here, you can see it's now added these other values here again. So at the very end, we're just going to have to recollapse all these so that you can't see these extra values here. So that's kind of something that I don't like about this workflow, but overall, I do like it a little bit better. So I now want to add the amount of clumps. So I'm going to click on this group input, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it. We're going to make another one, but then after I place it here, I want to press Alt P, and that's going to bring it out of the node group. And then I can also press Control H, and that'll make it its full size. So we now have this extra socket here. So this color ramp here, this is controlling where it's going to be the clumps and where it's going to be the dirt, because the color ramp is going into the factor of the mix shader. So if I drag this around, it's going to control how much of the dirt it's using and how much of the clumps it's using. So to make this customizable, I can press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the hue saturation value, and let's put this in between the darken and the color ramp. And then this value here is going to make the values lighter or darker. So you can see if I turn it up, now it's more clumpy, or if I turn it down, it's more of the dirt. So I can take the value, I can put it into the extra socket here, and then I can just click on this to rename it, and I want to rename it clumps amount. Now also, because this group input node is in the very center, I want to add the roughness and the bump into this same group input. So I first want to add the roughness. So the roughness values are right here. There's this color ramp controlling the roughness, and there's also this color ramp controlling the roughness. So to control this in the custom node group, I can press Shift A. I can go to the search, and I can add another hue saturation value, and let's put this here before it goes into the roughness. So then this value here is controlling the light and dark values. And then I also want to add another one right up here. So right here on the clumps, I'll press Shift A, go to the search, and I can search for another hue saturation value, and let's put that here after the color ramp. So now you can see the value again is going to make it more shiny or more rough. So let's take the value and I can put that here into the extra socket of the group input, and then I can click on this to rename it, and I can just rename it to roughness. And then right down here on the bottom shader, I want to take the value of this hue saturation value and I want to put it into the same socket. So put it into the roughness socket. And that way, outside of the node group, this roughness value here is going to change the roughness of both of the materials at once. And then I also want to add the bump strength. So let's take the bump, I can put it here into the extra socket. And then this bump here, I can take the strength and I can put that into the same socket. So then if you click right here on the strength, I can double click on it to rename it. And I'm just going to rename it to bump strength. And then I just want to add one more value, and that is going to be the displacement strength. So since this is pretty close, what I'm going to do is just take the displacement here. I can take the scale and let's drag this over, and I'm going to stick it here into the last socket here, the empty socket here, and I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename this to displacement strength. So now that I've created all of the custom node groups, I can click on each group input and I can press Ctrl H just to minimize it. So click on this one here, Ctrl H, this one here, Ctrl H, and if it gets bigger, you just need to press Ctrl H again just to minimize it again, and this one here, Ctrl H, and I'm doing that just to make it more organized. So I can now press the Tab key to go out of the node group, and the material is finished. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the material, and if I make this a bit bigger, we also have clumps color 1, and then also we have clumps color 2. And then we also have dirt colors 1, 2, and 3. Then we also have the clumps amount, so it looks more clumpy or it looks more just like the dirt, and this is just kind of changing between the two materials. Then we also have the roughness value to make it a more dry looking dirt or a more wet looking dirt, and then we also have this bump strength here, and then finally we have the displacement strength. And there we have it. So there is the finished procedural gardening soil material. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel and purchase the material, then you can get this material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. You can also check out my procedural material packs and my ultimate material pack if you'd like to purchase more materials. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. But I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.